Okay. Thanks everyone for coming to seminar today and everyone who's here in person today. I'm really excited to have Dr. Amanda Glaze speaking with us today. Dr. Amanda is an associate professor of middle grades and secondary education at Georgia Southern University. She attended Jacksonville State University, where she got her Bachelor of Science, Master's in Education, and Educational Specialist degree. She then moved on to get a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Alabama. Amanda specializes in science teacher education, evolution education research, and science literacy-focused public outreach. And her research centers on the intersections of science and society, specifically the acceptance and rejection of evolution in the southeastern United States, and the impact of perceived conflicts between evolution and religion and/or culture on science literacy. So join me in welcoming Amanda, and I'm very excited for her talk today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be with all of you, at least virtually, talking about science literacy and the ways that we as individuals, whether in a classroom in a formal setting or just through informal conversations, can have major impacts on science literacy in the public is something that's very special to me and something that I find very important. I am here at Georgia Southern University, which is in Savannah, Georgia, but for a little bit of context on why this is so personal to me, I actually grew up in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in rural Northeast Alabama in a young earth creationist Southern Baptist missionary family, and then went on to study evolutionary biology while also working on degrees in education. So I'm a bit of an academic mutt, so to speak. I have formal training through my PhD in evolutionary biology and then also graduate level molecular genetics, but then also chose to pursue science education because I really wanted to be able to get on the front lines working with students to help them overcome the kind of experiences that I had growing up. Science literacy is critical in today's society, and we hear that term thrown about very often. You know, it's important to be scientifically literate, but what does that truly mean to us? I think when we have these conversations set in the context of modern times with everything that we have seen and experienced during this pandemic especially, we see constantly this distrust of science in the news and in the media and on social media and among family and friends. We see questions about our integrity as scientists. We see questions about what we do and the choices that we make and the things that we share. What we want for people is the ability to look at evidence from a critical viewpoint. We want people to be skeptic of the things that they see and hear, but also to be able, no matter where they come from, no matter what upbringing, culture, religious background, whatever they bring to the table, we want them to also have that ability to critically think about the evidence that's in front of them and be able to make decisions that are framed in logic and based on evidence rather than just moving with our emotions. And that can be a very complicated thing to do. I've been involved in this area of study for more than a decade now. And one of the things that I've noticed over time is that we really have this strong lack as a society of what we term radical empathy. It's this very centralized notion that we're so surrounded by those that we agree with, that echo chamber concept, that it becomes very difficult over time for us to stop what we're doing and really take an understanding of other perspectives and personas and things that are what we would consider other to who we are and what we believe and what we ascribe to as human beings. So some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today are that concept of radical empathy and how that can play out to bring about what we call conceptual change, which is essentially adding to a person's worldview, a scientific worldview, that they can then lean on to make these decisions and build their scientific literacy. but also how we can take these things in both formal and informal spaces without being controversial, without being conflict oriented, and actually create a space for discourse that enables people to be scientifically literate, even when there are very strong personal barriers to things like the concept of science or specific parts of science, such as evolution. So I started by telling you that I came up in a Southern Baptist, young earth creationist family, and I can't see everybody's faces, but I know that some of them were probably pretty surprised because there doesn't seem to be a lot of connection between evolutionary biology and that kind of background. But I came into what I do through my own experiences in school. In the state of Alabama, the word evolution was only added to the state standards for K-12 education in 2016. So prior to that, it was seen as such a conflict-laden topic that it was something that wouldn't even be allowed to be discussed in school, wouldn't be included in the standards. And even to this day, we frequently see coming through as anti-science legislation at the state level and then across the region here in the southeastern United States. And a lot of that comes from our cultural underpinning here in the Southeast as evangelical, Protestant, literalist interpretation of biblical creation, Christian orientation. Now, it's very easy to separate and say, okay, that's a phenomenon for the Southeast that really doesn't impact us in this pocket of the country or in this pocket of the country. But one of the things that we found through research is that these mindsets are prevalent across not only the United States in different groups of people, but also prevalent across the world. And it's really a framework when you look at these contentious points that allows us to build conversation modes and even teaching approaches that specifically allow us to have discourse surrounding conflict topics. Now, if I say the word taboo, you probably think about something from the Dark Ages, right? So usually when we, I'm sorry?
Question.
Yes.
Your slides are not advancing. Is this on purpose?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry, we just noticed. And what?
No, that's okay. That's okay. You just get to hear me talk for a little while. I highlight in my slides some of the key elements. I'm sorry, I guess I could have explained that to you first. I don't generally talk to the PowerPoint. I just use that to highlight some of the elements that I'll share with you to take away. But in terms of evolution, we talk about evolution as a true taboo here in the southeastern United States. It's literally one of those things that is seen as not acceptable for conversation at the dinner table or for public discourse in a lot of spaces. It's something that there's intergenerational knowledge of from various positioning, whether that's positioning in the basis of the use of evolution in establishing grounds for further racism in the region, as well as our more modern focuses, which tend to be more tied to religious fundamentalism in the region and fundamental literalist interpretations of biblical creation. But it truly is a taboo. And if you haven't come up in that kind of setting, it can be very hard to conceptualize what that looks like and feels like from the perspective of the students that we are trying to teach in this region that are struggling with this personal conflict between what they're learning in their classrooms, what they're learning in their research, and what they've experienced as they were growing up and what they are getting from trusted members of their circles, including their family, their friends, if they're involved in church, perhaps their preachers and other groups in which they participate. Now, it seems pretty easy to say, well, it's evolution, it's science, right? So the more you know, the more likely you are to accept things. We know this is true for the most part, because in things like photosynthesis, we can talk about it in the classroom, we can go into the lab and we can watch the processes as they are happening, we can explore and study these things. And the more we see things like photosynthesis, the more likely we are to be okay with it, to the point that we'll say, yes, I'll talk to my friends and tell them about this process that's happening. Or maybe we're walking in the park one day with a member of our family and we're telling them about how the plant is using sunlight in order to generate its energy to function, right? The problem is this doesn't happen with things like climate change, evolution, stem cell research, and genetic engineering, because those concepts do not parallel a lot of parts of people's worldview that come up in these more traditionalist cultures. Now, one thing to keep in mind with worldview is that a worldview is not just an idea that you have one day. It's not just something you like or dislike. It's literally an identity construct. So it is a part of who we are, every bit as much a part of our personal identity as our racial background, as our sexual orientation, as our culture, the things that we have come up with, the things that we trust. All of those component pieces feed into this giant lens that we use to interpret everything that we will experience over the course of a lifetime. Now, the good thing about worldviews is that worldviews do expand in a lot of ways as we grow and as we learn, as we expand those bubbles in which we operate. The problem is, very often when we come into contact with someone whose worldview is not in alignment with ours, we have this natural human tendency to want to convince them that we are the ones that are correct and they are the ones that are incorrect. And in essence, win or overpower or overwrite that piece of their worldview. So let me begin by asking you, if someone comes into a room and they start a conversation by telling you what their perspective is and that their perspective is the only perspective and their perspective is the correct perspective, and that everything that you ascribe to is inaccurate or wrong or misinformed, or even worse, ignorant, how willing are you going to be to listen, learn, and ask questions? Would anybody feel welcome or safe in discourse in a setting like that? Absolutely not. But yet, for generations, that's the way we have approached this problem. We've approached the teaching of evolution as though it were a hammer and students as though they are a nail to simply be driven into the ground with our point of view. We've completely discounted the fact that there are some topics that just don't behave in terms of statistical relationships in the same way that most do. And in fact, I would argue that when you look at the data from students all the way up to professors, when you start looking at how much they know about evolution versus how accepting they are of evolution as a valid scientific theory, what you find is that there's not a statistically significant predictive relationship. There are plenty of people who know almost everything you could think of at a content level, we'll say introductory biology content level, about evolution. But then when they take a test on acceptance, they actively select, despite that knowledge and understanding, they select to say that they reject evolution as a valid scientific theory. The converse of that is there are people who absolutely ascribe to evolution as a valid scientific theory, but when given a content examination on the actual concepts that underpin that entire field, they score very poorly. In fact, among introductory biology students on a national level study, the average score on a content knowledge test for evolutionary biology, so we're talking introduction, so bio 1, bio 2 level conceptualization, the average score on that test was 48%. So a very low understanding. If your average score in one of your classes on a test like that was 48%, you would not assume that your students had learned those concepts. The average acceptance level was only moderate. So very moderate acceptance, very low understandings in terms of what's going on with evolution. Now, we've looked at a lot of different reasons why that can happen. But we know that in a lot of places, it's not getting taught. or it's not being taught accurately. For example, one reason why I focus on the Southeastern United States is because students in the Southeastern United States are 10 times less likely than their peers around the country to receive accurate instruction regarding evolutionary biology. So that's K-12 all the way up to intro. Similarly, 84% more likely to have no instruction whatsoever. So students coming into college classes having never heard the term evolution, except maybe to hear a teacher tell them, we're not going to learn about this unit in school because I don't believe in it. And so we're just going to move forward. Now, in the 21st century, that sounds a little bit ludicrous because we think about all of the knowledge that we have, all of the evidence we have, all of the varieties of experiments that have been done, all of the things that we think about when we say, oh, you don't accept evolution? Well, let me tell you about all this evidence. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of times the conflict in and of itself is so strong within individuals that parents don't want their students to learn about evolution. Teachers don't want to teach their students about evolution. And students have a fear created in them that if they learn about evolution, it's going to negatively impact them for the rest of their lives, in their relationships with their families, or in their faith and cultural relationships to which they hold very deeply. So you might ask, in light of all of that, okay, what can be done if approaching it from an evidence standpoint is not enough to bring about a change and open up discourse? If making sure I teach these things to my students in their introductory classes, if seeking out an evolution class is not enough to guarantee that I'm going to have an understanding and that those students or those individuals are going to understand and be willing to be accepting, then what are some of the things we can do? And that's where I really want to focus my attention today. In looking at creating spaces for discourse, these are things that can be applied not only in classroom settings or one-on-one settings with people that are in the field or have interest, but they're also things that can be used to have conversations with really anyone. I've had to have these conversations with family members. I've had to have similar conversations with fellow faculty in trying to find ways to best encourage students to open up those doors. And one thing to keep in mind with this is, again, we tend to regionalize. I talk a lot about how the South has these issues, but these issues can be found literally all over the country. If we look at the longest running Gallup poll on evolution, it's been running for almost 40 years. There has been almost no change in the number of people, the percentage of people reporting in those polls as creationists. In 1983, it was 44%. By 1998, it was 44%. By 2019, it was only 40%. So we're talking about a 4-point change in almost 40 years in the percent of people that were reporting a creationist view when it comes to evolution. Now, for theistic evolution, that's barely changed. So 38% in 1983, it's about 33% now. The one place we are seeing changes, which I'm sure you've probably seen things about this in the news, is that we have more people that do have a more secular view. So it once was 9% had a secular view, so no theistic interference whatsoever in evolution. That has now gone up to 22%, but it's taken 40 years for those changes to happen. And there have been a lot of cultural changes, things like the introduction of new technologies, the widespread nature of the internet. Now we have the ability to call up a world's worth of information in the palm of our hand. So we see a lot of shifting thinking in that level between secular and non-secular. But it's taken a lot of time. And we've had a lot of time to focus on this and do research and try to impact how we're approaching things like evolution, not only in the public, but in undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as K-12 education. So we would think that by now we would have had a little more of an impact than what we have when it comes to acceptance of evolution. So what can you do to impact someone in a way that is what we call respectful, culturally responsive, but also scientifically accurate and powerful? Well, we're going to talk about just a few things that are areas where you can focus, where you can actually engage with anyone, whether they're a student or otherwise, without necessarily even having to talk specifically about evolution. The first of these things is the concept of the nature of science. Now, we hear the term nature of science bandied about a lot more now than we used to, but it's important to understand that there are a lot of misconceptions, not only in the public, but among scientists, among professors, among biology majors, and other students about really what is science, how is it done, and what science isn't. One of the biggest problems that we have when it comes to the nature of science is that typically the arguments that are made against things like evolution, for example, two of my favorites are, but it's just a theory. Or, hey, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? I'm sure you've heard those before. But a lot of those are grounded in the fact that people don't understand what science is and how it is done. We see this right now with the pandemic, where everyone is up in arms because the CDC told us this in February of 2020, and then they said this in September of 2020, and now they're saying this. And so people are using things like that to distrust science. People are using things like objectivity and throwing out words like science is objective and unbiased, or throwing out words that science should be able to prove things to us. But they don't stop to think about the fact that science is not about proving anything, because science in and of itself is uncertain. They don't think about evolution being just a theory because they associate the term theory with a guess, as opposed to this giant collection of observations and evidence and experiments and all the things that give us our understanding of the mechanisms behind a concept. One of the most powerful things that you can do to help change people's perspective about even having a conversation with science when religion is involved is specifically addressing the fact that science is empirical. You think that everybody understands that science is based on evidence, but there are a lot more people out there than you would really think that believe to the depths of their being that the whole field of science exists to disprove the existence of God. And they come into a classroom, they come into a learning experience, they come into an interaction, bristling on the inside in ways because they feel that everything that is being said by their professor, by that scientist, by that authority that's talking on the television about the pandemic is somehow tied to this field that is out to kill off their entire religious experience. I've been amazed how something as simple as the beginning of my class lectures, whether it was with younger students when I was teaching in K-12, or with my graduate students who are preparing to go into science classrooms, or even in my intro biology classes and upper biology classes, that talking about the fact that you're correct. Nobody in science says God did X as a scientific theory, because they don't think about the reasoning is we cannot test for the presence of anything that's supernatural or metaphysical. And if you can't test for it, if you can't somehow collect data for that, whether that's historical or otherwise, then it can't be considered by science. Something as simple as that can diffuse a conversation so tangibly that I've actually watched people relax shoulders, change body language, because they were coming in preparing for a fight that you've just told them really doesn't exist. If you have people that you know, or students or people you're interacting with who struggle with the idea that there is this false dichotomy, right? That you either are an atheist scientist or that you're a person of faith. That dichotomy is frequently reinforced in media. It's frequently reinforced by some of the loudest voices that are out there, both in the scientific community and in their religious communities. If you need to point to people, point to things like the Broader Impacts Committee at the Smithsonian Institution, where they bring together scientists and leading members of communities of faith to have conversations about how these things impact our society. Of course, everyone is familiar with Francis Collins. Some of his famous statements about how he wished the things that he knew in science always aligned to his faith, but they don't. And so his science is one part of his life, his faith is another. That ties into the second concept that I want to talk to you about, and that is the concept of ways of knowing. You may have heard the term from Stephen Jay Gould of non-overlapping magisteria if you're a deep reader in the field. But this concept is actually very important because it's one piece of the conceptualization of what we consider to be ways of knowing. If you think for just a minute about the things that mean the most to you in your life. So just pause for a minute and think about it. Think about the people. Think about the places. Think about belief systems that you may or may not have, whether they're religious or otherwise. You're thinking politically. You're thinking personally. All of those things are informed from a lot of different perspectives. The worldview is a collective lens through which we view and experience the world, but our worldview is made up of thousands of lenses that overlap one another in so many different ways, and we collect those from all of those different people, places, and experiences that hold power for us. When we come at things from a perspective that is not considering of the fact that humans are by nature diverse. We have diverse ways of thinking, diverse experiences, so many things. We tend to take away the value of all of those other ways of knowing and want to simply supplant another person's worldview with what we see as the fit worldview. The problem with that is our goal really shouldn't be to overwrite other people and their cultures and their beliefs and their ideas. It should be to add to what they hold dear, the ability to think scientifically. So additive scientific worldview, not overriding. There is no one size fits all when it comes to what gives personal meaning to an individual. All ways of knowing have value, and we have to choose personally which ones hold the most value for us. But if we're not ever given a space to explore that scientific way of knowing, if we don't delineate that, so we separate scientific ways of knowing from things like philosophical ways of knowing. I had a student recently talk to me about, was talking about scientific concepts and mentioned, infallible truths. And I kind of stopped for a minute and I looked and I said, wait, where are these absolute truths, to which you're referring? And she was saying, well, science is absolute truth. And I was like, now, wait a minute. Now, we do our scientific study to explain things to the best of our ability, given the evidence, the technology, and the ability that we have right now. But are there really absolute capital T truths in science? The realm of truths, absolute truths, is philosophy. And so in this student's case, she had not yet been able to separate the bounding frameworks of what makes science science and what separates empirical scientific study from philosophical ways of knowing. After having that conversation and breaking those things down, she was better able to connect back to those tenets of the nature of science, that science is uncertain, it's tentative, it's ever-changing, it's self-correcting. And that in and of itself is a power of science because of the fact that it is self-correcting. One of the things with that is often when those kind of conflicts happen, we have a tendency to shut off our ability to listen and turn up our ability to talk. We really feel the need to correct that issue without really understanding where that issue is coming from. And so when people ask me, what's some of your best advice to give someone in science communication? So this is science communication across the board. My advice, however crass, is to stop talking and listen. Learn how to listen. You're always told when you're talking to an audience to know your audience, right? Try to understand where they're coming from. And thus our first goal in discourse is to establish understanding. That doesn't mean their understanding to make them understand us. That means to seek first to be open, to understand why those misconceptions are there, to understand where that worldview lens is pointing, and then be able to open a conversation about what we want them to take away from us. And this applies to pretty much everything in life. If you want to bring about a space for discourse where people feel safe, you have to be willing to stop talking, listen, and apply this beautiful concept of radical empathy. So differentiating between different ways of knowing. I mean, absolutely talking about this is science, this is what it can do, this is what it can't do, those bounds of the nature of science. And talking about things like the differences between belief, between faith, and the expectations and evidence requirements of religious traditions versus philosophical conditions can actually create a mental space for people to sort their thinking and open up room for conversations they otherwise may not be able to have. And there's a really amazing term for this. It's called cognitive apartheid. It actually allows us to create mental compartments and sort, because that's what we love to do. That's part of human nature and scientific nature, is to be able to sort things. It helps us sort and separate different component parts that allows us to look at things from new perspectives and creates a space in our worldview to consider other experiences. One big thing that ties into this, I love lies, damn lies, and semantics, right? It's very easy to argue semantics when you're talking about things like evolution. But if you look at the terms that are here, and again, this ties back to ways of knowing, between religious ways of knowing or cultural ways of knowing and scientific ways of knowing, as well as those nature of science tenets. Things like theory, hypothesis, and law can be hugely problematic because very frequently the definitions that people have experienced and learned have almost no differentiation. In a lot of modern textbooks, theory and law are both defined as a way of explaining physical events in a natural world. So they essentially have the same definition. And then when you throw in the fact that theory means a guess at something in common language, people get more and more confused and they start conflating theories with hypotheses. And then a great number of people frequently believe that theory means that it hasn't been proven yet, and therefore, if it's unproven, it doesn't become a law. So there's this mental major misconception that's very pervasive across groups, that a theory, when it is substantiated by evidence, is somehow elevated into a law. A great number of people do not understand the differentiation between a law, which is something like what's happening, what we're seeing, versus the theory being this giant collection of all of the data that supports those observations that we're making. Another key area is our terminology that really draws some tight and very tense connections when it comes to religiosity and evolution. And that's this big B word, belief. I frequently open my talks in public with this wonderful statement that really freaks people out. It's a great way to read the room. My name is Dr. Amanda Glaze. I don't believe in evolution, and neither should you. And you can tell very quickly which end of the spectrum people fall on. because people don't really know how to take that until I say, I don't have to believe in evolution. It is not a matter of faith or belief. It is a physical event that's happening in the world, and we have evidence to justify it. Therefore, I accept evolution as a process that is happening in this natural world. It's not a matter of belief. Now, it really sounds like splitting hairs to say, stop telling people to believe in evolution. But it's amazing the space that's created by that semantic shift, because it separates that science way of knowing from that religious way of knowing. Because we can believe in something without the presence of evidence. Usually we associate belief religiously as a matter of faith. We have faith in something. And faith, by definition, is believing in something when you don't have necessarily physical evidence to show that it's there, right? But we differentiate by saying accepting. We want to be accepting of evolution, because if you're accepting of something, you're welcoming of it. That means that you have brought it in, you're internalizing it. If someone's accepting of evolution, they're more likely to be willing to talk to other people about it, to read about it, to learn about it, to engage with it. And again, something as simple as a word shift can create an opening space and separate that concept that a lot of people have. I'm sure you've heard, if you're on social media or if you engage in these conversations, where people say, well, evolution is just another religion. You believe in evolution and I believe in God. It's another way to differentiate the conceptualization of what science is and is not. And again, research has consistently demonstrated over and over that the major misconceptions when it comes across fields of science are all tied back to that nature of science. And that it's especially important when you have contentious or conflict-laden topics, or things, we'll say, not conflicting to us, but perceived as conflicting in the public, that anything you can do to create that apartheid in thinking, to create that space where people can open up new area for consideration, is a positive thing. Why does this matter? Common phrases in science tend to kill us, right? We have to differentiate, especially among the public, keeping in mind that when you're doing science communication with the public, for most people, the last experience they will have in anything related to scientific study is probably high school level. So that's their last experience. And as you've learned from me today, a lot of people are not getting robust, accurate, scientifically sound instruction even at that level. And so anything that we can do to bridge those gaps can help us make headway in this battle for scientific literacy. So it's not a war of science versus religion. It's a bigger thing. It's a battle for scientific literacy. I had some people ask me about what are some things you can do in more formal settings. And so I wanted to just point you in the direction of some really neat free resources that are available to everyone that are culturally responsible strategies that specifically connect to introducing evolution. So these are great for undergraduate courses, whether they're majors or non-majors. Please don't ever assume that because somebody's a biology major that they're going to have a higher level of understanding or willingness to accept evolution. We've seen from research that that is not the case. But I wanted to share some formal and informal culturally responsive strategies. So if these tidbits you see are something you're interested in, I'll actually share the link during the towards the end when we're doing questions. But it's available at the Human Origins program for the Smithsonian Institution under teaching evolution through human examples, because we're actually working with people teaching and working with human evolution and non-human evolution in class settings. But these are freely available if there's something that you would like to use. So one thing that we've done with students, and this is across levels, so we've used these in university levels as well as advanced classes, as well as with teachers, I use kind of a variety of this even in conversation with people, because I go out frequently and have conversations in churches and community events to help them get over some of the hurdles for science that they have regarding science. But just little things, summarize the theory of evolution in a couple of sentences, whether they're talking to you or writing it down. You'll find there are some very interesting definitions out there of what evolution is and what it entails and what it does and does not include. And then kind of hit right on it. Are you aware of other explanations? So what are some other things? Now, this can be scary for some people because people would like to say, it's not my job to teach about faith. And this is not teaching about faith. This is literally acknowledging the giant elephant in the room that a lot of times people feel very uncomfortable about because of the way it is overlooked. They feel judged. They feel intimidated. This kind of acknowledges that and gives a little bit of space.
Spray them. So then in the night and the morning, we'll spray them with water and then they'll start growing, but they need time.
You can give me a thumbs up when you're ready. Okay. But asking them what other awareness they have. Is there something that they personally hold that gives them an opportunity to bring that out? If it's something that they haven't experienced, but it encourages students that haven't experienced that to think about the things that people are experiencing or thinking about when it comes to the theory of evolution. And then to list a few concerns that they have. It creates a private enclosed space to start mulling over what we know about and what we've heard about. And this allows you to really get into the misconceptions on an individual basis if you're having a conversation with someone and you're just talking them through this, or at a class level, being able to have students throw this at you on their way out their door or post it in a virtual setting where it's anonymous. It allows you to kind of get the tone of the room before you really even get started. Now, I know a lot of people would say, I'm not really worried about the tone of the room. My job is to come in and teach my science. And I agree, your job is to come in and teach your science. That's very important. But if we're teaching to people who aren't willing to listen, are you really teaching them at all? So when you can take just a few minutes and set the stage to learn your audience and see where they are, it can help you install some strategies that aren't even specific to evolution that can help open them up and allow them to be willing to drop the chip off their shoulder, feel like they've been heard in a way rather than judged in the classroom, and create a safe space. We talk about creating safe spaces and how important it is for people to feel safe and welcome and enabled in an environment. But we very frequently don't apply this to other elements of worldview where it's also very important. So these are things that we can do to expand on people's willingness to listen and learn, because it demonstrates that empathy, that you actually want to know what people's concerns are and where they're coming from when it starts. Now, if you do an activity like this or have a conversation like this and somebody says, well, I don't have any concerns, that's great. But it still gives you an opportunity to have conversations with them about, well, what if people do? If we want to change their thinking, if we want to really get at that whole portion of the population that could fall either way, every interaction we have with people, whether it's having a conversation about our thoughts about evolution, our experiments, our studies, things we're excited about on Twitter or some other social media or in a formal setting, being able to kind of spread that concept of being radically empathetic can actually do a lot to foster scientific literacy, kind of like a chain reaction. Another thing to talk about is this idea of who said what. I was talking earlier about the idea of cognitive apartheid. Cognitive apartheid is one coping mechanism for what happens when you experience something that really butts heads with your worldview. Okay, so we have 3 different approaches that people tend to take. One is conflict only. No matter what happens, they are going to be immovable. Okay, this is always a thing. You've heard the term "don't feed the trolls," right? So we talk about we don't feed trolls on social media. We don't engage with people who are simply out to pick a fight. That goes on both sides of the aisle. There are some people whose minds you are never going to change. They are rooted deeply in conflict. And so either their science or their religious beliefs or their culture or whatever it may be is absolute truth to them. It is immovable. It is not up for conversation or consideration. But a lot more people fall somewhere in the middle. And they're going to rely on one of 2 approaches. Either that separation maintains, so you create a space, they're able to engage with the concepts, have these conversations, and then they maintain that cognitive separation between their science understandings and between their cultural and religious backgrounds, right? A great example of this would be Francis Collins, right? A person of faith who is also a strong member of the scientific community. Or another direction that people frequently go is an interaction approach. Now, interaction approach is very tricky because I would never ever advocate for teaching an interaction approach in a classroom, because that's where you start getting into sticky spots, like intelligent design concepts. And that's why intelligent design has really gained so much momentum in specific class groups and things like that, class being K-12 teaching when it comes to standards, is because it really does foster a connection of specific religious leaning with specific scientific leaning. And so, I truly believe science's place is in the science classroom, that we're supposed to teach the science. But if people personally become scientifically literate and on their own ability and their own interpretation have that theistic evolutionary understanding, and they want to still be people of faith, and they kind of intermingle those 2 in their own mind, that's a personal decision. It's not something we teach, right? But it is a personal decision. So it does allow them space to reformulate their religious thinking in light of and with an understanding of science. But who said what really draws from different people. So there are quotes from, this is an example in the CRS that I was telling you about. There's quotes from the Dalai Lama, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Francis Collins. There's a wide variety of quotes that you can actually talk to people about and have them put them in a category of separation or conflict or interaction approach to help them actually create coping strategies. It gives them a way to look at where other people are with strong examples, right? And create a space where before they may have just felt uncomfortable. Now they actually have models of people who are making their faith or making their beliefs or their culture work in various ways with their scientific understanding. And for a long time, that hasn't been something that's been modeled. It was really more focused on the extreme because we were frequently coming into conflict conversations and situations relative to science and faith with a teach the controversy. This half of the class is creationist. This half of the class is evolutionist. I don't even like that word. And we're just going to argue with each other and somebody's going to have to win, which is really not conducive to anything. So it encourages and models coping strategies that we know people have and give them some models that they can actually then go out and explore a little bit more about if they're interested, and learn more from outside sources about how other people are dealing with their perceived conflict. In terms of informal connection, the same things can be applied We just have to make sure that when we're interacting with people, we don't walk in assuming that because they don't accept evolution, that they're somehow ignorant. So seek first to understand and then be understood, remembering that the goal is not to win, it is to foster that growth and enable that safe space. So think about what you're doing as really planting a seed. I just said don't teach the controversy, but I absolutely advocate for acknowledging the fact that in the public, there is a controversy. I frequently see people say, well, it's not a controversy. It's not controversial at all in science. Yeah, but the scientists already, at least mostly, agree with each other on a lot of these things, right? So we're not really worried about their scientific literacy as much as we are all the other people who later become politicians, right? So in a way, we have to recognize the fact that it's there. And instead of engaging it, instead of implying that someone's beliefs are wrong or dishonest, or singling out people from being from certain religious or cultural backgrounds, we have to really create these modeling spaces and really encourage space for safe discourse so that people will ask questions and be willing to understand and listen and learn. You know, creation stories to people of faith have deeply personal value in a lot of different cultures and religions. And so if you want to be able to have a conversation with people, regardless of where they come from, you really have to be willing to understand why they feel the way that they do and where those feelings are coming from, and be empathetic in a way that encourages conversation. In summary, the map to the gaps, to be able to bridge these gaps, are really tools that we can use not just in science, not just in science communication, not just relative to evolution, but really in everything that we do. Anytime we have a divide, there are ways to create space if you're willing to put in the time and energy. But for us, things like focusing on the nature of science allows us to have conversations in highly contentious situations where you don't even have to mention the word evolution. I've used this over a decade with members of my family who are still involved in the ministry. They're deeply devout, but they're actually willing to engage with me and talk to me now about evolution and ask me questions because they realize that I'm not here to step on people's beliefs, and that I'm actually doing work to help more people like them feel comfortable in learning science, but also helping people in the sciences, where my heart is, learn how to engage and interact with people who are often very different in terms of beliefs and backgrounds from what they are. We have to value different ways of knowing. All of those different ways of knowing that we personally choose to have as a part of our life are what give us meaning. And the human element, meaning, is critical. We have to be able to pay attention to the details of language. Tiny changes in the way that we talk about things can make a huge impact. We have to acknowledge that there is a controversy without engaging the controversy in a way that is negative or overpowering, because we want to encourage growth, not stifle it. We have wonderful resources that we can use, things like the RE-C that's come out of Arizona State University, things like the CRS strategies from the Smithsonian that take a culturally respective and responsible approach to breaching topics that can be conflicting. And then, of course, when in doubt, if you ever have a struggle with having a conversation with somebody about a controversial topic such as evolution, or controversial to them, and you're not sure how to deal with it, there are tons of resources and tons of people out here that are kind of bridging the gaps with the research and the outreach that we do to engage in specific faith communities and across groups all over the country that can actually help you navigate these things with your students or your family if you're like me. I hope that through this presentation, I've given you some key bits of information that you can use to change your conversations surrounding controversial topics. And I truly appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with all of you today.
Folks on Zoom could unmute yourself or raise your hands and ask questions. Are there questions in here? Are you asking a question, Michelle?
Oh, I can ask a question. I wasn't because I was waiting for students to have a first chance.
Oh, students want to take the first chance? Oh, yep.
So you mentioned a bit about how these lines between like faith and evolution don't always fall along maybe what we would predict in terms of areas in the United States. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the kind of political spectrum with regards to like faith and acceptance of evolution that you've seen in your research.
So there are a lot of assumptions that we make about exactly how that will fall. And looking at studies between 2018 and 2008 and 2019, we definitely saw a lot of impact on political leanings and connections among parties when it related to things like standards in states and even willingness to have those conversations. And so I don't have current data because we've had some major strength in policy and politics shifts in the last 5-6 years, but it does have a little bit of an impact, but it's not as strong as you would think because of the fact that we have so many pocket regions that when we look at states as a whole without breaking them down into their subregions. So for example, the state of Georgia, right, is identified typically as a red state, but because of cities like Savannah and Atlanta, with the larger population areas, it's really more of a blue state than a red state, but then we get into all the politics of gerrymandering and all that, so I'm not going to bore you to death with that. But we have to look at things from a de-regionalized perspective to really be able to pinpoint that. I do think we're going to continue to see the same kind of patterns. For example, we know in the South where the states are more red, we have less coverage of evolution in the standards. We have evidence showing that students are less likely to be taught evolution, but is that solely a function of political party? I can't tell you that I can't tell you for certain anyway, but I can't tell you that statistically because we do have some disorganized groupings. I'm sorry, I know that's not a very clear answer, but I don't have a yes, absolutely for you.
Great, thank you.
Michelle, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That was really, really, really great. I want to share a couple things and then ask a question, or maybe two. As a grown up as an Episcopalian and then going to a Southern Baptist college, I'm very familiar with a variety of the things that you've been talking about. Although my Southern Baptist college got kicked out of by the Southern Baptists because we had too many Yankee heathens or something like that and let people dance. But anyway, and then I did want to share one other thing, that there is hope in the world, in the sense that I gave a talk to a group of, I'm going to guess about 6th graders in a church. And I sort of started with, what do you think about evolution? And very quick, do you have any questions? And the very first question I got was, so why did Noah have to take two individuals of all the species? Couldn't he just take 2? And then everything else could evolve. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm done here. I thought it was really great. But so it was sort of like, okay, I don't think we don't believe in evolution sort of idea in that particular church, which I won't say more about that. Because what I wanted to ask you about, or your thoughts on and to comment on, is that I think another thing that kind of happens is scientists, when they encounter these situations to comment in, don't acknowledge enough, as you were recommending they do, about the role of the scientific method in their own ways of knowing. Because even in this talk, you gave us very little evidence. We didn't hear any results of experiments you did with trying this approach or that approach, and how did the people impact. With the method of knowing that we're using in this talk is the one that when I teach methods of knowing that a lot of scientists use and many humans use for everything. And that is, what does a wise person have to say about this? And that's almost what we're doing here. And we do that a lot as scientists. And then the other one we do a lot is we believe in the scientific method, and we go into a class and we take physics or something. We study photosynthesis. Well, we don't require that we see the experimental data, the hypothesis testing and controlled hypotheses for every single thing we learn.
Right.
We assume and accept that all those facts that added up to something were all individually tested. And yet we all know when we go try to track down well, who was it that first showed that chlorophyll A to B ratios are 3? And you discover that 18 gazillion citations ago, the proof was that so-and-so said it at a Cold Spring Harbor symposium. Well, that's not really doing it. So we know that we use a lot of emotion-laden ways of knowing things. We are emotional beings. We don't use the scientific method in our own lives to decide everything we're going to do. And there are many flaws in our scientific studies. So I think we don't necessarily have to go into all of that, but I think we have to be a little more generous with explaining that we also use all these different methods of knowing, and that and so I'm wondering how you feel like we can integrate those things, and how much the sort of kind of arrogance a bit of scientists that because we are scientists, we are rational about everything, which I think some of us think, how we could like soften those edges and how much that might help. So that's, I have another question, but I think I talked long enough. So thanks.
So interestingly enough, the nature of science goes deeply into that. And one of the things that I advocate for is we need to have nature of science courses for everyone. That needs to be a part of our intro courses, especially if you're going to be a major. You need to really understand that, because the tenets of the nature of science tell us about the tentative nature, about the fact that we try to be empirical, but it is subjective, and it is informed by creative processes, and it is informed by inferences. It's inferential, it's socially embedded, it's culturally embedded. It really gives you a shift in your perspective about what science is, because we tend to Thomas Kuhn it. Oh, it's these phenomenon and it's very neat, and there's this one scientific method which we know is not a thing, right? I hope we know it's not a thing. No scientific method, there's not one. There's a million of them, right? But you know, coming up in the sciences, I didn't have a course on the nature, philosophy, and history of science until way late in grad school. And it rocked my world, because like you said, these concepts that we pass from generation to generation of scientists through our training and our interactions frequently overemphasize the importance of our voice of authority in that research. And you hear science, you probably heard colleagues say, science is unbiased. What? No, it's not. Now we take steps to try to mitigate, and we have peer review processes, but science, like every other endeavor, is a human endeavor, and therefore it is impacted by human nature. And that's why, we want, if you're a good scientist, you want everybody to be skeptical of what you're saying, because if they're not, you're not getting tested on what you're learning. You're not learning, you're not growing. So, that getting into that nature of science, if you have an opportunity to even peruse the internet and look at some of the resources that are out there, they can really shift your thinking about things. And I think, Michelle, you're already there because you're going through these conversations with me. But for anybody, if any of those comments were like, huh, what? If it was surprising to you, I really encourage you to familiarize yourself with the nature of science and do a little bit of reading on the history and philosophy of science and really know your field, because it will open your eyes and really, I think, make you a better scientist and a better person.
Well, let's see. There is another good question in the comment in the chat by Monica. Do we have time for that? Yes, we have time for that. I'm going to summarize. You can read the whole thing. But Monica says that vaguely, what is the best way to convince stakeholders, government, public, that science research is not a waste of money? Because often people say things that, well, like, studying that random frog is better, that money is better spent on infrastructure or healthcare or something. This is, Monica comes from a developing country where the government often just wants to support research that has a direct economic or social impact due to limited resources. And, in fact, we know that many scientific papers, a lot of scientific work doesn't come to definitive conclusions. So how can we convince people that in general, it's not wasted, even though some portion of it doesn't end us up with conclusions?
It's really hard to try to set that as a goal, because there's always going to be people that just don't. There's so much money that gets spent. Obviously, I will say not enough from my perspective. But, we spend this money on things like basic science, and it's very important. And yes, trying to convince somebody that putting a shrimp on a treadmill, you hear that joke all the time, right? The shrimp on the treadmill, the Benny Hill music, but there are legitimate purposes to understanding the mechanics of things, or understanding, the interactions. When it comes to talking to people about that, I think what gets lost frequently is that failure is more important in science than success. Because failure, when things don't behave the way we want them to, that is when the paradigm shifts in science and we have a whole new wing to explore. And, it may sound crazy, but I really think we should start publishing negative results. A lot of times in our journals, if it's not big, novel, and new, it doesn't need to go, they're like, oh, well, it's not going to go out there. It's not new enough. It's not big enough, whatever. But I really do think that we should make the public more familiar with the fact that there are all of the, for these 5 tests that work, there were 575 and 2 gels on the floor that didn't. So therefore, it's the failure that helps inform us to get to the place where we are, where we do have understanding. But people don't want failure, just like they don't want uncertainty. They want us to be able to tell them with 100% certainty that X is going to happen 100% of the time. And they want us to do it on a $500 a year budget. And they want the results now, and they want them, in nature. Because that's where the power is. I think our steps for that, though, are creating scientific literacy, improving how people view science, and being a face for science. You don't have to be a doctor in the sciences to be a face for science and advocate for scientific literacy and have these conversations. And the more we have these conversations in the more places, and it comes from a variety of people, from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of places, I think over time, the public will start to kind of shift in their thinking, because then it's not, this science authority that they see on the TV that's been given this power telling them what to do. It's, hey, my friend Michelle over there, my friend Peter, my friend Sabrina was telling me the other day that they were doing this in the lab and they thought this was going to happen and this didn't happen, and look at what they learned. Power comes in grassroots, and I think that's going to be as important for science and getting people to understand, yes, we spend a bunch of money, but if we don't learn anything. And, we can build all these infrastructures, but if we're not building technologies to help make them better, then we just stagnate anyway. So I'm sorry, kind of a long-winded way to go about that, but it's, basic science research is something that I'm passionate about as well.
Yeah, sounds good. We should probably, given the time, thank Amanda again. And what's happening now, Sabrina?
There'll be a tea time starting in about 5 minutes. So at the same Zoom link, I think, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
And if any of you have questions or want to have a conversation about something, I am absolutely open to extended discourse. So you can find me on Twitter, or you can email me. I am more than happy to talk more or answer questions if you didn't have a chance to ask or were uncomfortable. And I'll actually share a document that can be posted or shared out that has a lot of the resources and other groups. So for example, AAAS has a group called DOZER. It's the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. NABT has DBER, the discipline-based ed research that looks at how we impact public and teaching. There's organizations like SABRE. Sinai and Synapses has a fellowship where they bring together scientists, religious leaders, teachers, and stuff from around the country. So there's tons of people that are exploring these arenas and tons of resources that are free and available to everyone. So I'm happy to share a lot of that information if you want to know more.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Where are you gonna go? Where are you gonna be? I was gonna go on my full laptop. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. I have to take off. I can't stick around. So, Amanda, I'm
Yes.
gonna make you I have to take off today.
Okay,
I
no
can't
problem.
stick around. But I'll make you host of this meeting, and Sabrina will be there shortly. Is that all right?
That's absolutely fun.
Awesome.
I'm going to come down there from my office. I'll see you in a bit. It's Michelle.
I don't think anybody's going to be in this room still, and I'm not sure where Sabrina's going.
Oh, okay. I thought the way you said that, I thought she was going to be in 123. All right. Well, I'll stay here. That's okay.
Where are you going to be, Sabrina?
Oh, there we go.
Oh, she's going to be where she is. Right. That's,
It's in your
man, my
office.
sense of virtual reality is so screwed up. There's real people in the real room, but she's not there. Okay. That's crazy.
I am going to step away for just a moment.
Sure.
And
That's fine. Yeah. Me too, maybe.
See you, Michelle.
Bye-bye.